Raiders burst from the dust behind her at first light, and the woman, running flat out across Wyatt Calloway's range, would become his wife. That early June morning in 1883, on the open grass of the Tularosa Basin, New Mexico Territory, what began as a manhunt became the first chapter of the truest thing either of them would ever know. Her name was Catori. She was 23 years old, a woman of the Mescalero Apache, and she had done what she had done deliberately. The men chasing her knew it. She ran with that knowledge too, and she did not run ashamed. Watch all the way through. If this story moves you, leave a like and subscribe. It means more to us than you know. Now let's go back to the Tularosa at first light. The Tularosa Basin in early June is a country of competing extremes. The alkali flats to the south go white as a dry lake bed before the sun even clears the San Andres range, and the grama grass on the higher benches holds its color only until mid-morning when the heat grinds it pale. The Sacramento Mountains rise steep and blue to the east, carrying timber on their upper slopes that a person can see from 40 miles away and never quite reach on foot in a single day. Between the mountains and the flats lies a broad band of broken country, volcanic rock outcroppings, sand washes running north to south, stands of sotol and cholla, and the occasional section of shallow valley where grass grew thick enough and long enough to support cattle for the better part of a year. The valley grass was what Wyatt Calloway had built his life on, and by the summer of 1883, he'd been building it for 4 years. He'd come to the Tularosa in 1879, a rancher from West Texas, with enough saved cash to buy 420 acres, a small adobe that needed work, a barn that needed considerably more, and a water right on a spring-fed creek. He'd spent those first 4 years building the place up by increments, expanding the adobe to 5 rooms, putting up new corrals of cedar post and wire, digging a second well on the east side of the property, running fence across the east pasture and down the length of the south flat until the boundaries of the place were defined in something more permanent than claim documents. By June of 1883, he had 300 head of cattle in good condition, a reputation among the other ranchers in the basin for trading fair and showing up when there was trouble, and a life that, by most reasonable measures, was going exactly as planned. The plan, as he'd originally drawn it in the first years, had included a wife and children by this point. That part had not materialized. There'd been a woman in El Paso 4 years back that he'd come close enough with to be thinking about a ring, a schoolteacher named Helen, who was practical and warm and who had chosen him for a lot of things before choosing a mining engineer out of Colorado for the one thing that mattered. He took the news without any visible reaction worth describing, came back to the basin, and spent the better part of the following year working himself from first light to past dark in a way that had less to do with the amount of work available and more to do with the particular mercy of exhaustion. By now, the idea of a wife had become abstract. One of those things a man knows is probably still ahead of him, but has stopped watching the road for actively, the way you stop watching for rain once a dry spell has gone on long enough that your internal calendar of expectation has quietly revised itself. He was up before first light on June 4. He had a long practice of rising early that had more to do with the quality of the early hour than with any ranch corps that specifically required it. The time before sunrise in the Tularosa Basin was a cool and quiet thing. The sky going from black to gray to a building orange that spread down from the top of the Sacramentos as you watched, and the cattle out in the east pasture making low sounds in the gray, and the whole of the world seeming in that hour temporarily simple. He built a fire in the kitchen stove and stood at the east window with a tin cup of coffee and watched the sky come up over the mountains. He was still at the window when she came over the south ridge. He saw her first as a dark shape against the pale pre-dawn sky at the crest of the ridge line, moving fast, too fast. A person running like that, at first light, alone, is not running for exercise or to settle a bet or because the morning appealed to them. The shape dropped down off the ridge into the open valley below at a dead sprint, and even at 300 yards he could read the urgency in it, arms pumping hard, head tilted forward, no pause to check direction. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were going or didn't care which direction they covered so long as they covered it fast, and both interpretations meant the same thing. Something was behind them and was coming. He set down the cup and moved for the door without hurrying. He was on the porch, rifle slung under his arm, when the riders came over the ridge, 4 of them. They came over the crest in a loose group, working the horses hard down the slope, and when they hit the valley floor they spread slightly. The automatic adjustment of experienced riders working to cut off angles, to use the width of the flat to keep her from going diagonal. The first gray light was enough to see the rifles across their saddles, not slung, and, swinging, laid across and ready. The woman was still running. She was on the flat now, close enough that he could see the detail of her Apache, by the cut of her moccasins and the length of her hair loose behind her, and she was moving through the grama grass with the driven, flat-footed stride of someone who had been at this for longer than this morning. Not the sprint that burns out in 2 minutes. The math of the situation was clear from the porch. She was not going to outrun 4 horses in open country. She had maybe a minute before they caught her. He stepped off the porch and walked to the gate. Not running, walking, because a man who runs toward a confrontation often gets one he didn't want, and a man who walks toward it sometimes gets a conversation instead. She reached the gate ahead of the riders by a good margin. She stopped when she saw him standing there, and for the first time she looked back at the men behind her, 40 yards and closing hard. And then at him. Her face was not the face of a person who had run out of fight. Her jaw was set, her eyes were level, and what was in them was not pleading. She was reading him the way a person reads a road they've never traveled, taking the measure of the risk, calculating what it was likely to cost. He pulled the gate open and stepped back to give her room. She came through at a walk. Not a stumble, not a desperate lurch. A walk, shoulders back, like she was stepping through a door she'd been waiting to find. She stopped about 8 feet inside the fence line and turned to watch the riders. Wyatt pulled the gate shut and dropped the latch. The 4 riders pulled up at the fence. Their horses were lathered and blowing, which meant they had been pushing hard and had been doing it for a while. The lead rider was a thick-necked man in a canvas duster wearing a lawman's star, not a star from any county in the territory that Wyatt recognized, which was most of what he needed to know before the man opened his mouth. The other 3 spread along the fence line in the practiced arrangement of people who want you to understand they have options. The lead rider laid out his case with the confidence of a man who has rehearsed it. The woman was a fugitive from lawful custody, property of the Dolan Trading Company out of Lincoln, a debt labor contract. She had run 2 days prior, and the company's right to recover her was a matter of territorial contract law. Wyatt listened without interrupting. Then he made 2 points of his own, both of which he made with a quietness that did not disguise the fact that they were not negotiable. The first was that the star the rider was wearing was a company star, not a county star, and carried no enforcement authority over private property. The second was that any contract with Dolan Company terms was designed to produce a debt that could never actually be retired. The provision costs, plus room and board dockages, plus conduct penalties totaled a number that grew rather than shrank. And everyone in the basin who had looked at one of those contracts closely enough to understand the arithmetic had come to the same conclusion. What the rider was enforcing was not a labor contract. It was a mechanism for holding people indefinitely without naming what that was. All of this came out of him cleanly and without anger. She was on his land now. That changed the situation. There was a pause. The lead rider looked at the woman standing behind Wyatt, then took Wyatt's measure in the way men who deal in coercion take the measure of obstacles. assessing what kind of resistance this was, whether it was the kind that would hold or the kind that could be moved with sufficient pressure. Whatever he concluded, it was apparently not worth a confrontation this morning. He shifted in the saddle. This was not settled. He'd be back. Not a threat, exactly a statement of fact from a man not in the habit of leaving things unresolved. Wyatt told him where to find him. The four riders turned and went back up the south ridge at a walk. Not a retreat, a tactical withdrawal, at the pace of a group that had more options than this one morning, and knew it. Wyatt turned around. She was watching the riders crest the ridge and drop from sight, her eyes on the exact point where the last man disappeared. Only when they were gone did she turn to look at him. She had high cheekbones and dark eyes that took in a great deal without returning more than she intended. Her hair was long, and the fabric of her shirt was torn at the left shoulder. She had been running on bare feet across hardpan and rock and grama flat, and her feet were cut from it, and she stood like none of that was relevant information. She put her hand flat against her own chest. Catori, Wyatt. He tilted his head toward the house. Come inside. I'll make more coffee. She considered the offer, and the man making it with the same even attention she brought to the ridgeline a moment before. Then she nodded once and followed him. He did not attempt conversation while he got breakfast going. Water on for coffee, cornbread sliced from yesterday's pan, dried venison, brought in from the shelf and set on the table without ceremony. She sat on the bench near the door, which was a position that gave her a view of both the south ridge and the north approach, and he clocked this and let it stand. She ate carefully and without haste. He gave her time. The light outside moved from gray to gold, and the day settled into itself. When she was ready, she spoke, in English that was deliberate and slightly formal, the precision of a person who learned a language from the outside in and uses it with care. The Dolan men would be back in greater numbers. He agreed. He'd have trouble now for what he'd done at the gate. He agreed with that, too. Then she asked why he'd opened it, and he took the question seriously and gave her a real answer, because 4 men on horses are not justice, and because she'd come through under her own power, with her eyes clear, meaning she was somebody who still had a plan. He wanted to know what the plan was. Something shifted in her expression. Then a recalibration, a revision of some internal category she'd assigned him. She laid out the plan and then the facts behind it, because she was the kind of person who believed you should understand what you were agreeing to. 3 days to get word to her band northeast in the foothills, so they would know she was safe and would not come looking for her in ways that brought additional trouble to his land. The story of how she'd come to be running across the Tularosa at dawn came in sections, delivered with the flat, efficient manner of a person who has been shocked past the shock and is now in the phase of being practical about damage. The Dolan Company had been operating what it advertised as a labor contractor service out of Lincoln County for 2 years. The mechanism was straightforward in its cruelty. Agents found Apache families during hard seasons, drought years, periods when Army movement had disrupted their routes, bringing provisions in exchange for work contracts at company operations. The provisions were real. The terms were not what they looked like. By the time a family had eaten the provisions, they had signed over 6 months of labor at wages that were docked against the cost of those provisions, and further docked against company rate, board, and room, and subject to penalties for infractions of the company's conduct code, which had been written with the breadth necessary to generate penalties at will. The mathematics of it were a trap, with a door that closed behind you. Catori had not signed herself in. Her cousin Kesso, 16, doing his best in a hard winter, had contracted for both of them without fully understanding what the terms would produce. By the time she ran the numbers and understood the structure of it, they were already 4 months into a 6-month contract, and she could see clearly that at the end of it they would owe the company money, not receive any. 3 weeks ago she had seen her chance. a Dolan man left a pen of horses unsecured during a night of drinking. She went in before dawn and led out 2 animals. Not company horses, as it turned out, but horses that belonged to neighboring ranchers and had been collected by the Dolan men under a pretext of stray recovery. She walked those horses back to their owners at first light. She did this with full knowledge that it would be read as theft of company property. She had made certain Kesso was away from the operation first, sent him back toward the mountains with a message for the band, and placed the accounting squarely on herself where she intended it. Then she ran. 2 days of it. Moving at night when she could, using country she'd known from childhood, when the band ranged freely through the basin before the army began narrowing the routes. She knew every water source, every rock outcropping that provided cover, every dry wash that ran in one direction before dawn and looked different in the afternoon light. She had not been running blind. She had been running with a map that existed only in her memory and was more detailed than anything drawn on paper. She laid all of this in front of him, and the risk she'd placed on him alongside it, the Dolan Company's reach into the county courthouse, the way what he'd done at the gate would be characterized. She did this with the directness of someone who believed a person had the right to know what they were standing in before they decided how to stand. He would write to the county sheriff and to his lawyer in Mesilla. He would handle it. She gave him the even, careful look that was. He was beginning to understand her version of making a decision. Then she said she didn't know yet whether he was a fool or a brave man, and that perhaps there was not much difference. He'd been called both, he told her, and found some truth in each. He gave her the back room, the addition he'd built as an expansion, and had been using for storage since there was no one else to put it to. Cot pulled from the corner, clean blankets, the wash basin brought in from the kitchen. She moved into the room the way she did everything, without ceremony, treating it as a practical fact. He went out to the cattle, and the ordinary work of the ranch went on around an extraordinary center. The next 3 days had a shape to them that consistently surprised him. He'd expected to work on edge, one ear always cocked for horses coming back over the south ridge, the rifle close at hand, the concentration of his work disrupted by the pull of watchfulness. He was watchful, but not in the way he'd anticipated, because she was watching too, and she was better at it than he was. By the second morning he understood she had built her own observation system covering angles he hadn't considered. The high ground north of the barn, the dry wash east of the east pasture that could conceal riders working toward the corrals, the curve in the wagon road where it bent around the limestone outcropping a mile south and would raise dust before anyone came into view. She didn't announce her surveillance. She conducted it in the early morning and at dusk, standing at the windows or at the barn's south corner with the patience of a person who has learned that patience is a skill like any other, practiced until it produces information. And occasionally, in a few words, she passed the information to him. Before dawn on the first full day, a Dolan rider through the east wash, counting his cattle. Second morning, 2 men on the high ground to the north, an hour's watch, then south. Mapping the water? She passed these reports with the brevity of someone who has learned that the useful part of information is the information itself, not the frame around it. He adjusted the south pasture cattle moved to the near corral at night. The hen rig came inside from the barn. A letter went to the county sheriff via a rancher passing through, asking about the legal standing of company labor contracts under current territorial law. On the afternoon of the second day, he found her in the barn. She was standing in the center aisle with her hands easy at her sides, speaking to his 3 horses in her own language, low, unhurried syllables that moved through the barn the way water moves through a place, filling the spaces between things. All 3 horses were at the front of their stalls, heads over the rails, attending to her with the specific ear-forward attentiveness that horses reserve for people they have decided to take seriously. The bay gelding, his best horse, and a connoisseur of human character with standards that most people found unnecessarily exacting, had its nose approximately 2 inches from her shoulder which represented a level of voluntary proximity Wyatt had never witnessed the bay extend to anyone he hadn't known for at least a year. He stopped in the doorway and watched for a while without speaking. She was aware of him. She was always aware of everything in her vicinity, but she didn't look up. When he came in and took a halter from the hook, he asked what she talked to horses about. The same things people talked about, without inflection, where they came from, what they'd seen, what they thought came next. He glanced at the bay. The bay looked back at him with the expression it reserved for hay that didn't meet expectations. What did the bay think came next? "Rain," she said. 2 days or so. He checked the sky through the barn door. Clear and high. But the bay had a record for these assessments that consistently outperformed the almanac. The rain came on the fourth morning, not 2 days away, but close enough to make the point. A steady spring rain moving through from the northwest in the small hours, leaving everything in its wake, smelling of wet sage and wet rock and the particular mineral sweetness of stone that has held heat all day, releasing it into cold water. He lay awake listening and thought about the woman in the back room, and what would happen when the 3 days were gone and the band sent word. It had started as a clear moral situation. 4 men on horses were not justice, and an open gate was the right response to an unjust thing. That remained true, and he did not second-guess it. But the situation had developed a longer tale than he'd expected. She had been in his house 4 days, and something in the house's quality had changed. Not encroached upon, not cluttered, but different in the way a room changes when another genuine intelligence is attending to the same space from a different angle. He had been alone long enough that he'd stopped feeling the absence of that. He was feeling it now, in the specific way you feel a thing when it arrives after you've stopped expecting it. He kept this observation at a practical distance. She had a band and obligations to it, and she had not come through his gate, looking for a rancher. She had come through because the gate was open, and the alternative was worse. On the 4th morning she came to breakfast resolved, with the edge of reluctance that sits alongside resolved, when the decision being enacted is the right one, but costs something. Her cousin Queso was 3 hours north. Word had come in the night. She needed to go this morning. He would ride with her. She looked at him. Not necessary, her expression said. He told her he'd feel better, knowing she got there, which was the truth, and left the rest of the truth, that he simply was not ready for the morning she stopped coming south, unspoken, because it was not his to say yet. She briefed him on her Uncle Nakey, not easily read by people who didn't know him. She would need to speak first, and Wyatt would need to wait while she did. He would wait. They should go before the rain stopped, she said. It would keep the dust down. They rode north in the light drizzle. She took the roan from his barn. He'd saddled it before asking, on the assumption that 3 hours on foot after 2 days of running was unnecessary punishment, and she rode it with the ease of someone who had been on horseback since before she was big enough to lift the saddle, which was exactly right. They did not talk much on the ride. They had developed over 4 days of sharing a house, an understanding that silence between them had no obligation to be filled. Both of them watched the country, he the ridgelines, she the draws, and lower brush where riders would shelter if they were waiting. Nobody was waiting. The band's camp was set in a fold of the foothills, tucked into pinon and juniper, on a slight rise that gave clear sight lines in 3 directions. He counted 18 or 20 people, and approximately that many horses picketed in the trees behind the upper edge of the camp. Children disappeared into the brush when they rode in. 2 older men came forward to meet them with the unhurried deliberateness of people who have long since stopped being startled by circumstances. Naki was a man of perhaps 50. He had a face built for authority in the way some faces are. Heavy features arranged with the weight of someone who carries decisions for many people and has spent decades not explaining himself to anyone who couldn't read the gravity of it. He looked at Wyatt for a long time. The assessment was thorough, and it was not hostile, and Wyatt understood the distinction. Catori spoke at length in their language. Wyatt waited. He worked at looking like a man not intensely aware of being assessed, which was difficult because he was precisely that. When she finished, Naki turned to Wyatt with questions in English that was deliberate and precise. Had Wyatt stood between her and the Dolan men at his gate? Had he known her before that morning? Had she stayed in his house? To each question, Wyatt gave a direct answer, and when the question about the house required a clarification about the back room, the clarification was given plainly. Then Naki arrived at the question most people in the situation already had. Why had Wyatt opened the gate for a stranger? Wyatt gave the same answer he'd given twice before. It was the same answer each time because it was the true one. Naki took all of this in with the same flat cataloging attention he brought to everything, and when he was done, he made a statement in English that was both assessment and verdict. Wyatt was not wise, but he tried to be honest, and that was better than most. Alope, Naki's wife, had her own views, which she communicated to Catori in a series of rapid asides. While Wyatt ate the venison and cornbread they pressed on him. Catori translated the parts she chose to translate. The parts she did not translate were evidently not unfavorable, based on the way Alope occasionally looked at Wyatt with the satisfied expression of a woman whose prediction has been confirmed. He stayed longer than he'd planned. Kesso turned out to be a 16-year-old of uncommon seriousness, who studied Wyatt across the fire with the careful attention of someone who had recently learned that documents could be used as weapons, and was not yet sure that men couldn't be used similarly. Wyatt gave him his most uncomplicated attention, and by the time the afternoon was more than half gone, the boy had moved from caution toward something closer to guarded curiosity, which felt like progress. Catori rode with him most of the way and turned back at the top of the South Ridge, where the valley opened below them in the last orange light, the cattle moving slow in the east pasture, the creek picking up the color from the west, everything laid out the way it had been laid out for 1,000 years before either of them arrived in it. He looked at his valley, and then he looked at her. She was reading it in the way she read everything, not casually, but building a map in her head, the kind that stays useful after the subject of it is no longer visible. He noticed this, and felt the particular discomfort of a man who recognizes something he doesn't quite have language for yet. If she needed anything, she knew where the gate was. She looked at him with an openness he hadn't seen from her before. The assessment and the calculation were still there, but behind them or through them was something simpler and rarer. She knew where the gate was. Then she turned the roan and rode north into the Pinon, and he watched until the trees closed behind her and rode down the ridge to his house. Over the following 3 weeks, the Dolan Company made its moves in sequence. The first was a man claiming a territorial land agent designation. Come to examine Wyatt's water rights documentation, he looked at everything correctly filed and left without apparent benefit. The second was a civil notice, served by a deputy from Lincoln County, for $300 in breach of contract damages under the Dolan Company's operating partner's signature. Wyatt engaged Addison in Mescalero, a sharp and dry attorney who had made a modest career out of ranchers' disputes with commercial overreach, and Addison's response apparently landed with sufficient force that the civil action was not pressed further. The third move was direct and deniable. Someone cut the east pasture fence one night in early July and ran 40 head of Wyatt's cattle into the dry wash to the south. He spent 2 days recovering them and lost 3 to a gully crossing. He wrote all of it down with dates, had Addison file it, and kept building the record. He also rode north 4 times in those 3 weeks. Once with news of the civil action, in case Naki's band needed to factor it into their own assessments. Once to return a braided horsehair rope that Catori had left on his corral rail when she'd come south one afternoon unannounced to check on the roan. Once with a parcel of salt and cartridges, the kind of supplies that territorial stores sometimes shorted the Apache bands on, whether by design or by the ordinary indifference of commerce, and in either case a practical correction. And once, and this 4th time, He examined his own motives, with the honest clarity he tried to apply to most things, simply because he was riding north anyway, and the camp was in that direction. It was not in that direction. He rode north because he wanted to, and because he was done finding excuses for it. She was there each time, and she received him with the same level directness she'd had from the first morning. They talked in the way people talk when both are sensible and have something between them that neither has given a name to. In exchange, she gave him things about the basin that he'd been living in for 4 years without knowing. Historical water sources the old maps placed incorrectly, the route the Army used when moving through the country unofficially in the winter months, the way the late summer weather came in from the south, the specific configuration of cloud over the San Andres Range that preceded a hard blow by about 6 hours. He put before her the cattle situation, Addison's work on the civil claim, the 40 head he'd spent 2 days recovering. She took all of it in, and when he finished, she told him the Dolan Company would come in force. Not more papers, men and rifles in numbers sufficient to make the situation feel settled regardless of the law. He thought she was right. When they come, you should not be alone. The force came on a Thursday in mid-July, mid-morning, the heat already building, and the dust from the South Ridge visible from a long distance. 7 riders this time, the lead man from June 4th at their head, and among the 7, one wore a badge that would carry weight in a county court, and all of them carried rifles and the relaxed confidence of people who had brought enough of both to make the conversation short. Wyatt was at the well. He saw the dust column rising, went inside for the Henry and 2 revolvers, and came back to the porch. He had been there less than a minute when he heard horses from the north. Naki came over the ridge with 11 riders, Catori among them. They came down the north slope at a walk, unhurried, deliberate, the pace of people who have already done the thinking and are now simply doing the thing. They came through the north gate and spread across the high ground behind the house in a way that put them above the south approach with clear sightlines in all directions. It was done without declaration or display. It had been planned, probably since the conversation in camp, when she'd warned him the Dolan men would come in force and he should not be alone. The 7 riders came through the front gate and stopped when they processed what was arrayed behind the house. The lead rider looked at Wyatt. He looked at the 11 people on the high ground. He calculated. The mathematics of the situation had changed substantially since June 4th. 11 people on the elevation above the approach versus 7 on the flat. Wyatt and the Henry, an attorney in Mescalero with a documented brief currently before the territorial governor's office, and a record of Dolan Company conduct that had been building on paper for 3 weeks. None of this had existed in June. The conversation that followed was brief. The lead rider opened, with the matter having gone past a labor contract dispute. Wyatt's answer: it had never been one. He laid out plainly, and without heat, what the Dolan Company's operations actually were and what Addison's brief argued under current territorial law. The rider's closing position was that the company was not through with this matter. Wyatt expected that was right. Then the rider turned and took his 6 men back out the gate at the same deliberate walk they'd arrived at, and they went up the South Ridge, and at the crest, the lead rider paused and looked back, which was its own kind of message, and then went over. After they were gone, Naki came down from the high ground and stood with Wyatt in front of the house. He confirmed that Wyatt had written to the governor's office through his lawyer. Wyatt confirmed it. Naki looked at him with the same long inventory he brought to everything significant, and then there was something they should discuss that evening at camp, his tone making clear that what he had in mind was not the Dolan Company. That evening was a long one. Naki laid out in careful detail the shape of the Dolan Company's strategy against the band, not just the labor contracts, but the systematic pressure on water access, on grazing routes, on the freedom of movement the band had exercised through the basin for generations before the Army began constricting it. The company's goal, as Naki read it, was to make the basin too costly to inhabit without company association. It was a larger picture than Wyatt had been looking at, and coming out the other side of that conversation, he felt the particular disorientation of a man who has been living adjacent to something important without seeing its full shape. He also came out of it having spent 2 hours sitting next to Catori at the edge of the fire, and not quite being sure when that had become the natural position and not finding any inclination to change it. She watched the fire and occasionally put something into words, and he found that an hour of comfortable silence next to her was the most rested he'd felt since June 3rd. Riding back under the full moon, the basin silver and enormous around him, he was honest with himself in the direct way he preferred when no one else was present to influence the conclusion. He had been telling himself for weeks that he was riding north, for practical reasons. News to relay, a rope to return, salt and cartridges that were useful gifts. He stopped telling himself that. He was riding north because she was there, and because the hour he spent in her vicinity was the best hour of whatever day it fell in. He was in love with her, and acknowledging this was not dramatic because it was not a surprise. It was a statement of a fact that had been true for some time and that he had simply been allowing himself to work up to. What to do about it was a different question and a genuinely complicated one. She was Apache and he was white, and they were in 1883 in a territory with clear opinions about those arrangements, expressed in social pressure and in law. Her band had structures and obligations and histories he was still learning. He was a man who had stood at her side in a fight, which was one kind of relationship, and not automatically the same as the kind he was now thinking about. She had given him no clear signal that she was thinking about it at all. He kept going north. She came south twice in the following 2 weeks, riding down with Kesso, who had recovered from his winter of Dolan Company involvement and was applying a 16-year-old's extreme precision to every document he encountered, which seemed like a healthy adaptation. They came to check on the roan, which was the announced purpose, and stayed through meals, which was the practical outcome. On the second visit, Kesso spent most of the afternoon in the barn with the bay gelding, who received him with a cordiality that Wyatt found genuinely astonishing given the animal's history. One evening in late July, sitting on the porch in the last of the light, she offered without preamble that the Dolan Company was pulling back from its southern operations. Naki's sources had it that the governor's inquiry had made their situation difficult enough that they were adjusting their methods elsewhere, not stopping, that was not their nature, but redirecting. The information arrived with the same flat efficiency she brought to all information, and then she was quiet. The light went from orange to the deep blue of pre-dark. The cattle moved into the near pasture from the east, slow and content through the grama grass. Then came a different kind of quiet, and she broke it with, she had been thinking about something. The way she put it made clear this was not a passing thought. He waited. He rode north often, she observed. He agreed. She had been riding south often. Also accurate. Was Ed. This represented a considerable amount of riding, delivered flat and precise, which was her register for things she intended to land, and something in his chest went still and warm simultaneously. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the full, undivided attention she brought to things that mattered. What were they riding toward? He thought about the complications, the territory, the year, the communities, the law, the categories that people would apply to the two of them, and the disapproval those categories carried. Then he thought about the woman on the bench next to him, who had come through his gate running for her life, and changed the texture of everything since, and he thought that the complications were real, and that he was done letting them be the deciding factor in this particular question. He was riding toward her. If she wanted to know the truth, she held his look for a long moment. She knew. She had known for a while, and she had been waiting for him to put it into words. He exhaled once, controlled, and looked at his hands on the porch rail. How long had she known? Since the salt and cartridges, a man doesn't ride 6 hours round trip to bring salt out of courtesy. Outside, the last color was leaving the Sacramento ridgelines. The first stars were showing above the peaks, and the evening was as quiet and good as any evening he'd known in the basin. which was to say it was very quiet and very good. He didn't have a map for this. He didn't know how it was supposed to go, in her tradition or his, when the situation was what it was. What he knew, he wanted her in the house, not the back room. The house. If that was something she wanted, he'd very much like to work out how. There was a ceremony among her people. Not a marriage in the form he knew, but carrying the same weight. Naki would have to agree. Her family would need to be part of it. He'd like to meet her family properly. She smiled then, not the quick, almost smile from the first morning, but a full one, and it changed her whole face in a way that rearranged something in him permanently. Her uncle would question him for a long time. Wyatt would be asked things he did not expect. He'd answer. Honestly, she knew that. That was why she wasn't worried. What came next took time, because time is the honest medium in which serious things are built, not an obstacle to them. Naki put Wyatt through 3 long evenings of questioning in the camp, covering practical matters and less practical ones, the water rights, the cattle operation, what Wyatt understood about the band's situation in the basin, his family history, what he believed about obligation. These were not comfortable conversations, and Naki showed no interest in making them comfortable, which Wyatt respected the more he thought about it. At the end of the 3rd evening, Naki delivered his verdict. Wyatt was not wise, but he tried to be honest, and that was better than most. It was the same assessment he'd made the first night, which meant it had held up to 3 evenings of examination. Alope had strong views about the whole business, and communicated them to Catori in rapid asides throughout, which Catori translated selectively, and the portions she did not translate were evidently favorable based on Alope's expression when she looked at Wyatt with the pleased satisfaction. The ceremony was held in late August in the camp, with the elders present and specific obligations acknowledged aloud, and practical gifts exchanged in both directions in a way that was serious and without ornament. Kesso stood with Catori. Wyatt had brought Addison, who attended with the particular dignity of a man in unfamiliar country who is paying close attention and trying hard, which was the appropriate approach. Addison also had the county judge enter a civil record because property law required it, and the judge entered the record without notable comment, which was either progress or pragmatism. They went back to the adobe. She moved her things in, not many, but chosen, and the house absorbed her presence the way a landscape absorbs a river. Not resisting, simply becoming what it had always been going to be, once the water found it. The back room became her workroom. Wyatt learned not to disturb its order, the way she had learned not to disturb the order in his barn, and neither of them had to say anything about either arrangement, because it was understood. The cattle did well that fall. The Dolan Company did not return directly. Addison's quarterly reports, suggesting the governor's inquiry had applied sufficient pressure to redirect their methods elsewhere. Naki's band moved through the basin as they had always done, with Wyatt's water and corrals available when needed. His name in the county records a small and legible fact about who owned this particular stretch of the Tularosa. In December, she told him she was expecting a child. Directly watching his face while he absorbed it, he sat down. It was not something he did in the middle of the working day. He sat in the chair by the east window and looked at her standing in the doorway, arms folded, the particular quality of attention she brought to everything fully present. He sat for a moment and then asked, was Alope going to have opinions about the name? The laugh that came out of her then was the full, real kind, and he had worked months to produce it, and it was everything he'd hoped. Alope had opinions about everything. They would argue about the name pleasantly. He looked at her in the doorway, in his house, with December snow on the Sacramento ridgelines, and the cattle dark in the white pasture, carrying his child. The life he'd built over 4 years had become something different from the plan he'd drawn, larger, stranger, less predictable, and in every way that counted more than he'd known to ask for when he drew the plan. He thought about the morning at the east window with the coffee. He thought about the dark shape cresting the south ridge at a sprint. He thought about the gate. He thought about the kind of man who opens it. Tell Alope she could have the name. He was not going to argue with a woman who read the weather better than the almanac. She shook her head with an expression of fond exasperation that was, in his experience of her, the highest form of approval she regularly distributed. He was learning. Slowly, he agreed. Yes, but he was learning. The spring came the way spring comes to the Tularosa by accumulation, one warm morning at a time, the snow pulling back from the Sacramento ridgelines, the creek rising in its banks, the grama coming in green on the south flat. Wyatt worked the ranch. Catori rode the basin with Kesso on good weather days, covering country she knew in a depth that 4 years of Wyatt's occupation had barely touched. She knew the springs, the ruins, the route markers carved into rock faces, the places where the land held water underground, long past when the surface suggested it should. She shared this knowledge in the practical, offhand way she shared most things, and he filed it away, because it was useful and because every piece of it revealed something about where she had come from and what it meant to belong to a place the way she belonged to this one. Their daughter was born in early May, in the camp, with Alope and 2 other women present. Wyatt waited outside with Naki in the piñon, not talking much, which was the appropriate response to the situation, and which Naki enforced by his own example. The child arrived strong and announced herself with sufficient volume to satisfy the entire camp on the subject. Alope came out first, with the satisfied expression of a woman who has solved a problem she was working on for some time. He went in and sat beside Catori and held the baby, who had dark eyes and an expression of profound assessment that seemed, at 4 hours old, to already be cataloging information about the room and the light and the faces of the people present in it. Catori watched him hold their daughter with the quality of attention she had brought to everything since the first morning, seeing without filtering, reading what was actually there, deciding what it meant. The baby had his stubbornness. She observed the baby was 4 hours old. She could already see it. He considered his daughter and thought she was probably right. They named her Nali, a word from Catori's language that held the meaning of female cousin extended outward into the territory of friend and ally, a name Alope had apparently prepared at some point during the previous winter, having settled on it well in advance of any formal consultation with the parties most directly concerned. Addison filed a civil record for her too, and it went into the county books without event, which was a small additional piece of the world coming out the way it should. The gate on the south fence stayed hooked open most days that summer, not abandoned, maintained, kept in working order, but held back against the gatepost as a standing fact about what the place was. The south ridge watched the basin from its same height, indifferent as all high ground is indifferent to what happens below it. The cattle grazed on the south flat. The creek ran clear and cold from the spring. The bay horse in the near corral had developed a detailed policy about who was permitted to groom him, and the list was specific and included people Wyatt would not have predicted. It was not a simple life. It had not become simple, and it was not going to. The Tularosa Basin in the 1880s did not offer simplicity to people trying to hold particular ground against the arithmetic of power, and the ground Wyatt and Catori were holding was not the easiest kind. But it was theirs, built the way things worth having are built, by showing up, by being honest, by opening the gate when the gate needed to be opened, and standing on the near side of it when standing was what the situation required. He had spent years thinking he needed a plan that worked out the way plans are supposed to. He understood now that what he had was better. A woman who read the country as well as he worked it, a daughter who was going to be trouble in the best possible way, an uncle who held him to account relentlessly and kept him accurate, and a bay horse with the most exacting personal standards of any living creature he had encountered in 33 years. The morning was still the best part of the day. He still got up before first light and built the fire and stood at the east window with a tin cup of coffee and watched the sky come up over the Sacramento Range. But now there were sounds from the rest of the house behind him, the small ordinary sounds of other lives occupying the same rooms, moving through them, treating them as home. Those sounds made the morning feel like something beginning rather than just a practice. And on the mornings when Catori came to stand at the window beside him, coffee in her own hand, watching the orange build down from the mountain crests, the way they'd watched it 100 times by now, the valley below them in the early light, the cattle slow in the pasture, the creek catching the first color from the east. On those mornings he thought that of all the gates he had ever opened in his life, the one he had pulled back on June 4th, 1883, with 4 riders coming over the ridge and a woman running flat out through his grama grass, had opened onto more country than he had known was there. He did not regret the territory. Not 1 acre of it,